All right, folks, Chapter 4 looks at biosocial and other contemporary perspectives. So we're expanding upon the material that we covered in Chapter 3, those early biological theories. So to start with, let's review some terminology so that we know what we're talking about. A genome is a complete copy of the entire set of human gene instructions. Genes are made of DNA, and they carry coded instructions for making everything the body needs. Chromosomes are bundles of genes. Now, genomics research currently focuses on finding individual differences from this reference sequence obtained from the Human Genome Project. That's where they sequence the entire genome sequence of a reference human genome. Now, information related to this is expected to support the development of public policy options related to crime prevention and offender treatment. Now, the Brain Activity Map initiative tries to learn about specific details at the molecular level about how different regions of the brain interconnect and function and how the brain processes information. So let's start talking about genetics in the environment. So in 1993, Ropers and Brunner are two Dutch criminologists, and they claim they uncovered a special gene that has links to criminal behavior. And they did this by studying the Netherlands' most dysfunctional family. Now, it turned out these folks had normal IQs, were unable to control their impulses, and often in trouble with the law, and the arrests were always of men. So within this dysfunctional family, they found 14 men that they classified as genetically driven to crime. Because men have only one X chromosome, they're especially vulnerable to any defective gene. Women have two X chromosomes, so there's a backup gene if one defective gene can be compensated for by a correctly functioning one in the second X chromosome. So what they identified in this group of men was a mutation on the gene responsible for the production of MAOA, and that affects criminality. So MAOA is an enzyme. It's involved in the process by which signals are transmitted in the brain. So what it does is it breaks down neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemicals that facilitate the flow of electrical impulses between neurons. So, for example, the presence or absence of serotonin and noradrenaline, neurotransmitters are affected by that MAOA production, and those are linked to aggressive behavior. So men with the mutated gene do not produce enough of that MAOA enzyme to break down a lot of chemical transmitters. This means that brains are overwhelmed with stimuli, and this may result in uncontrollable urges and criminal behavior. Now, neuropsychology is research that tries to examine that relationship between these neurotransmitters and our behavior. Now, in the 90s, some Utah researchers found a pleasure-seeking gene that they suspect plays a role in deviant behavior, addictions, and maybe even murder and violence. So this gene is an allele. It's a variation of the DRD2A1 gene, and that gene is involved in controlling the flow of dopamine. Dopamine is a powerful chemical that gives people a sense of well-being. When that gene is defective, it diminishes dopamine function. So that may drive a person to engage in other activities that increase that level of dopamine. So that could include drug taking, drinking, or engaging in other activities. Now, Caspi and Moffitt in 2002 proposed gene-environment interaction model. Childhood maltreatment is a universal risk factor for antisocial behavior. So children who grow up maltreated frequently develop conduct disorders and display antisocial personality symptoms. As a result, they become at greater risk of becoming violent adult offenders. Also, repetitive childhood hunger contributes significantly to a lack of self-control and increased violence in adulthood. Now, not all maltreated children grow up to become criminal. So what's happening there? Well, Caspi and Moffitt hypothesized that the development of antisocial behavior is mediated by an interaction between a gene responsible for producing that enzyme MAOA and the childhood maltreatment, their environment. So variations in the MAOA gene interact with stress, and that may increase the risk of crime in males. So maltreatment, we know, has lasting neurochemical correlates in children, and that deficient MAOA may cause neural hyperreactivity in children in response to threats. So childhood maltreatment predisposed most strongly to adult violence among children when their MAOA is insufficient. So basically, children who have high MAOA, even if they experience childhood maltreatment, did not develop antisocial behavior. Now, a 2008 analysis of AdHealth, that's an adolescent health survey that has several waves, found that low MAOA can interact with neuropsychological deficits to produce low self-control and delinquency. So basically, this genetic predisposition plus an interaction with the environment can lead to criminal behavior. Now, this continued focus on MAOA has led to the concept of the warrior gene. And variants of the gene were found in boys, and those boys were then more likely to engage in violence, to use weapons, and to join gangs. Now, a 2017 study found that variations in this gene interact with distal and proximal stress, and that leads to increased risk for criminal behavior in males. Now, in 2011, Fontaine made an argument that some forms of callous, unemotional behavior are genetic. So first, let's talk about what we mean by heritability. That's the idea that a proportion of the variation in a trait within a group of people that can be attributed to variations in their genes rather than to their environment. So how much of a particular behavior, how much of a particular trait is genetic versus environmental? And they were able to link callous, unemotional behavior among twin boys. Now, aggression in toddlers is also strongly associated with genetic factors, and early childhood propensities may evoke negative responses from parents and peers. So basically, early physical aggression needs to be dealt with and dealt with care. Now, heritability doesn't mean certain inherited genes inevitably produce that bad behavior. The genes basically may influence how people respond to their surroundings. So a criminal gene may just be a genetic predisposition to respond in certain ways to a criminogenic environment. So basically the formula is genes times environment, GXE. And that determines our behavior. Now, epigenetics is the study of chemical reactions that occur within a genome that switches parts of that genome on or off at strategic times and locations. So things like stress, diet, behavior, toxins, and other factors can activate chemical switches that regulate whether or not certain genes are expressed. Behavioral epigenetics is the way our genes interact with the surrounding environment, and that produces changes in ourselves and our behavior. Now, one predictor of early childhood violence and violence later in life is birth trauma. Now, the peak age for violent behavior we often talk about as being 20, but it's actually age 3, and early intervention strategies can be very effective. So where do we go now in terms of the study of genes and crime? Now, this explanatory power right now is pretty limited because it only applies to the specific environment of a study. If the population changes or the environment changes, how those genes are expressed will also change. It also doesn't allow us to predict whether or not a specific trait will be expressed in any given individual person. Some genes respond to human experience rather than determine it. Now, what about brain dysfunctions? We can study this using a PET scan, and it's often done by examining the prefrontal cortex. And one thing that a PET scan does is it measures the uptake of glucose by the brain. Now, Rain looked at PET scans of 22 murderers and found they had much lower levels of glucose uptake. So perhaps prefrontal cortex deficits, and that prefrontal part of your brain is responsible for rational decision making, may be related to violence in some offenders. Damage to that prefrontal area is associated with being impulsive, loss of self-control, immaturity, a lack of tact, inability to modify and inhibit behavior, and poor social judgment. Now, prefrontal cortex dysfunction has to be evaluated in terms of how people exhibiting that condition interact with their environment. So this may predispose someone to crime rather than directly causing it. So for instance, damage to that or dysfunction in that prefrontal cortex could lead to failure in school, an inability to hold a job, problems in relationships, etc. Those things then in turn may influence whether or not someone is involved in criminal behavior. Now, Rain identified an 18% reduction of the volume of the amygdala in psychopaths, and that is also a reduction in the size of their prefrontal cortex. And he argued that by examining brains of children as young as 3, criminologists could see signs indicating potential for troubled behavior. Now, neurocriminology is a perspective that looks at the links, your neurological links between your organism, your social factors, and criminal behavior. So violent psychopathology in young people is associated with structural and functional damage to the brain's orbital cortex. And this led to frontal brain hypothesis. This is a perspective that references physical changes in certain parts of the brain and how that might lead to criminal behavior. Now, there's also other brain mechanisms involved in aggression. One is mirror cell deficiency. So mirror cells become active when we watch other people move, and it seems to reflect an interpretation of what others are doing. Those deficient mirror cells may lack empathy, be psychopathic, or autistic. Also, things like allergic reactions to common foods can play a role here too. That can lead to swelling of the brain and the brainstem, which can in turn impede the higher faculties, reducing your sense of morality and creating conditions that support impulsive behavior. Might also impact your central nervous system, which can reduce the amount of learning that occurs during childhood, which then in turn contributes to delinquency and crime. Now, physical injuries, emotional trauma, disease, and long-term exposure to stress can also impact our brain. So, for instance, flu and expectant mothers can impact brain development. People who are exposed to high levels of stress over long periods of time are at risk of their brains rewiring in a way that leaves them with fewer cognitive resources. Residential segregation based on race produces lifelong stressors, including exposure to violence, social disorder, and poverty, and this leads to high-risk behavior. Now, neuroplasticity is our brain's ability to alter its structure and function in response to experiences we have. People who experience physical violence at the hands of their caregivers show extra activity in the amygdala and the anterior insula. And those parts of your brain are involved in threat perception and anticipating pain. And those who experience physical violence this way have changes in their brain that are very similar to soldiers exposed to combat. Now, biological embedding is the process by which social experience changes our neural circuits in our brain. Changes in brain structure due to these embedded, stressful, or traumatic childhood experiences can influence development and persist throughout life. So the interplay here between heredity, biology, and social and physical environments is probably very complicated, and it may provide the key nexus in considering what actually causes criminal behavior. And here we can see a picture of the brain highlighting all these areas, our prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the insula, etc. Now, research has also linked violent and disruptive behavior to our body chemistry, which is influenced by what we eat, any vitamin deficiencies we have, contaminants in our environment, and the endocrine system. So things like our blood sugar level. Hypoglycemia is a low blood sugar level, whereas hyperglycemia is excess sugar consumption. Now, excess sugar consumption is linked to hyperactivity and aggressiveness. And the idea that excess sugar consumption results in hyperglycemia could be linked and could then be linked to crime has been accepted by the courts. Food additives can play a role as well, dyes, artificial flavorings. And other studies suggest diets deficient in various vitamins and other nutrients could increase aggression and agitation. Now, another thing to think about is environmental pollutants. Toxic pollutants, things like lead and manganese, can cause learning disabilities, an increase in aggression, and a loss of control over impulsive behavior. Combine that then with poverty, social stress, alcohol and drug abuse, individual character, and other factors, and then we may see situations that are conducive to people committing violent crime. Now, lead in particular is very potent and destroys the myelin sheaths that surround brain cells, therefore interfering with neurotransmission. That's that communication between your parts of your brain. A 1% increase in the amount of environmental lead leads to a 0.46% increase in aggravated assault. And the level of exposure to lead is a reliable predictor of the number of juvenile offenses among males in the population who have been exposed to this lead. It also helps predict the seriousness of juvenile offenses and the number of adult offenses. Now, lead also diminishes our ability to detoxify poisons, which can heighten the effect of alcohol and drugs. Pollutants break down our inhibition mechanisms, and so we tend to lose our natural restraint that holds our violent tendencies in check. Now, other things that are important may be prenatal substance exposure, things like marijuana, tobacco smoke, and alcohol. Children whose mothers smoked 1 pack per day during their pregnancy had average rates of conduct disorder symptoms that were twice as high as those who did not. This is twice as strong amongst male teens, and smoking by pregnant mothers contributes slightly to subsequent antisocial behavior by their children. Now, psychobiotics is the study of the psychological and behavioral effects of bacteria on the mind, feeling, emotions, and behavior. And the central focus here is on gut bacteria, bacteria in your digestive system that produces chemical messengers that interact with the brain and nervous system. And when some types of this are absent, it could lead to depression. So there is probably an existence of a chemical gut-brain axis within the body. And introducing proper bacteria can produce positive results in mood and behavior. But this is still in its infancy. So we're still really learning about this. Another biological relationship that's very clear is low resting heart rate in crime. It's associated with psychopathy, aggression, and antisocial behavior. Again, studies of children as young as 3 show that measured heart rates have been able to predict with considerable accuracy which children will be antisocial in their teens, and it partly explains higher offending among men. This is probably the best replicated, meaning people have repeated this study and found the same results, biological correlate of antisocial behavior. So some suggest this is a marker of low autonomic arousal, and this is an unpleasant physiological state akin to boredom. It causes those who routinely experience it to seek added stimulation. And others suggest that low heart rate reflects a relative lack of fear, as well as perceived lower likelihood of sanction. So this can lead to poor choices and increased aggression. Now, this relationship is well established but not fully explained. It's found only among men, not among women, but it's also found among well-conditioned athletes and associated with certain medical conditions. Now, galvanic skin response is skin conductivity, and these readings can be used to assess physiological responses to stress and other stimuli. Low levels of skin resistance are associated with high moisture levels produced by sweat. So this indicates physical and emotional arousal. Now, most people, when startled or frightened, experience automatic changes in their body. So when you're startled or frightened, usually your heart rate increases, you breathe faster, you start sweating, you salivate less, and you have increased electrical conductivity of the skin. This is basically your fight or flight response kicking in. So we can measure that, and low GSR levels are associated with antisocial and aggressive tendencies. Those people have low arousal, and so they often seek out activities that will stimulate their arousal. They seek stimulation and excitement. Psychopaths have a higher level of skin resistance than others when viewing emotional facial expressions or when presented with offers easily recognized as inherently unfair. Now here's another thing, this 2D 4D ratio. This is a comparative length of length between your index and your ring fingers. And this is influenced by exposure to androgens during fetal development. More exposure leads to a smaller ratio, and the ratio tends to be lower in men. Some researchers have suggested this 2D 4D ratio can indicate stereotypical male characteristics like aggression, risk-taking, and criminal behavior. But critics say that this is influenced even more strongly by ethnicity, as opposed to gender. Now, hormones are chemical substances produced by the body that regulate and control the activity of certain cells or organs. And testosterone is primarily a male sex hormone, and it is linked to aggression, although it is found in female, but generally in a much lower rate. So it may be responsible for male criminality. There is a consistent relationship between high blood levels of testosterone and increased male aggression. Now, the direct relationship between testosterone levels and degree of violence is used by or seen by sex offenders. Anabolic steroids are also linked to destructive urges and psychosis. We also see adolescent problem behavior and teen violence rise as the amount of testosterone in the blood rises among young men. And Booth and Osgood found a moderately strong relationship between testosterone and deviance. Now, that's mediated by the influence of testosterone on our social integration and prior involvement in delinquency. In other words, that testosterone level is there, but it's moderated by our social environment. Now, small changes in testosterone levels in women are also linked to aggression and personality changes. Now, another thing to look at is our blood levels of serotonin, which is also associated with violence in men. Serotonin regulates our learning, our mood, and our sleep. Now, it's postulated that the role of testosterone is to produce dominant-seeking behavior, but not overt aggression. When frustrated with an inability to achieve dominance, serotonin acts to reduce that psychological impact of frustration and to produce calmer responses. So men lacking in serotonin feel frustration more strongly, more acutely, and tend to respond more aggressively, especially if they have high levels of testosterone. Now, imbalance between levels of serotonin and dopamine is highly associated with psychopathic traits. And the thyroid hormone T3, along with dopamine and stress hormones, cortisol and norepinephrine, are implicated in delinquency and poor impulse control. Elevated levels of T3 are also associated with alcoholism, psychopathy, and criminality. And blood serum levels of T4 are negatively related to antisocial behavior. Now, there's an intimate relationship between T3 and T4 and abuse and antisocial behavior, but we need more studies on this. Increased oxytocin levels, the trust molecule, are linked to altruism and trust. This is the chemical that creates bonds of trust, and it's responsible for the warm feelings people feel after sex or after giving hugs. When oxytocin levels rise in the blood, people respond generously and caringly. Now, Crime and Human Nature, written by Wilson and Herrnstein, identifies constitutional factors contributing to criminal behavior. In terms of gender, this is male. In terms of age, young adulthood. In terms of body type, remember from the prior chapter, mesomorphic, that's that athletic, muscly build. Low intelligence, and in terms of personality, impulsive, aggressive, and cruel traits. Now, constitutional factors predispose one to specific types of behavior, and societal reactions to these predispositions determine whether or not the behavior continues. Now, biosocial criminology emphasizes that interaction between biology and our environment. Biosocial perspectives of theories are theories of criminality, not crime. So crime is a behavior that violates the law, whereas criminality, we're talking about a trait, a willingness to violate individual rights and social norms. It includes a relative lack of empathy, conscious self-control and fear, and self-centeredness and a penchant for risky behavior. Now, biosocial explanations are likely to be couched in terms of a propensity for violence, aggression, deceit, recklessness, and fearlessness. Now, those that are vulnerable to ASPD, which is the DSM diagnosis that is most closely associated with being a psychopath, include those with biological differences in our resting heart rate, hormone levels, and EEG. And this is partially a function of genetic makeup. During childhood, it expresses impulsivity, attention deficits, aggressiveness, and conduct disorder. And you won't be diagnosed with ASPD if you are under the age of 18. Now, biosocial theories emphasize the interaction of those factors with their surrounding environment. Now, we know there are these strong gender differences in terms of crime, right? The overwhelming majority of crime is committed by men, somewhere around 75%, with about 25% committed by women. And men are also more likely to engage in violence, aggression, and serious crime. So how do we explain this gender gap? Male-female criminality data shows surprising regularity over time and over cultures. So that difference remains, that male-female gender gap remains over time and across cultures. Now, biosocial criminologists suggest that organic correlates of gender explain this problem. Now, sexual selection is one of the primary contemporary paradigms that's useful in this, and it's based on the idea of natural selection. So the role of childbearing, child protection, and child rearing creates evolutionary pressures for women to become sensitive to the immediate environmental stimuli, right? Because they need the ability to shield their offspring from danger. So as a result, females may be more sensitive to many environmental stimuli, be more easily aroused, and quicker to respond. Now, to compensate for low levels of arousal, men tend to be more sensation-seeking. Reproductive success drives men towards greater levels of aggression. Remember, of course, all of this is moderated by the environment. Now, the evolutionary perspective seeks to explain behavior with reference to human evolutionary history, and it recognizes the influence that genes have over our human traits. Now, it also argues that some of the same genes must be involved in both reproduction and criminality. And the dopamine transporter gene, DAT1, is related to both a greater number of sexual partners and related to antisocial behavior in adult men. Now, the evolutionary neuroandrogenology androgenic theory, says that the propensity for crime commission evolved as part of the male reproductive strategy. A particular neurochemistry characteristics of males increases the probability of crime amongst men relative to women. So what are the policy implications of this? Now, the standard social science model assumes humans come into the world like blank slates and then they acquire values, behaviors, and modes of thought through their socialization. The effect of our genes is indirect. It's mediated through a complex chain of events in the brain. So there's no particular genes for criminal behavior, but genes can affect our brain functioning and influence how we learn complex behavior patterns. Now, what are some critiques of these theories? Again, these biosocial perspectives have been criticized because they fail to accurately predict criminality, yet they purport to understand its causes. They're also criticized for methodological problems. So they often use small, unrepresentative samples, and they're often conducted on offenders in clinical treatment settings. So it's difficult to generalize those to other types of offenders and other types of settings. They also fail to explain regional and temporal variations in crime rates. They cannot account for age differences in crime rates. And some biosocial criminologists have been accused of race and class bias.